Welcome to the video. We're going to talk about patterns and motion and what makes them static and what makes them more useful as maybe real-time dynamic evolving patterns. Big difference between the two, and let's talk about that. So for my first demonstration, I'm going to play a Maximo string library. This is from Sonokinetic, and it's one of their older libraries. But it shows us the problems you run into when you're using patterns or phrase-based patterns, and you immediately run into some issues. But hopefully I just demonstrate some of the ways that different VSTIs try to get around this and help the user, but it's still quite limited. So I'm going to play just the higher tone phrase here in this library. The rest are muted for now. And I'm going to play some chord changes, right? So as I play these chord changes, the phrase changes only tonally according to the new chord. It's not adding new notes and giving you different variations of the actual phrase. And that can be a problem because your ears pick it up quite quickly and identify it as just a repeating pattern in your music. So to get around issues like that for phrase-based libraries, they've given you some options. So here we have RTS is going to play the same chords, but this time I'm going to tell it to use a Sonokinetic strings library with four-way switching, which means in this library they tried to get around the static pattern by giving you 4 different slots to put in different patterns. So now not only am I going to play a chord in the blue section here, but the RTS is going to play it's going to change the module here using these yellow and red keys here. It's going to step through these changes and variety here. So because you can change each slot to have a different pattern, but there are issues with that. So let's play it first. So you hear that it's playing the chord change and it's also changing the phrase. But the problem is that even though you're given, in this case, 3 different variations of this phrase, as I step through, there's only 2 or 3 variations, and most of these only have 1 variation, maybe 1 or 2. So you're quite limited. So you end up with a library that's very exciting, gives you great phrases, but you have to really be crafty in how you put it together in your song so that the ear doesn't pick up these repeating patterns and say, oh, that sounds fake. So in their newer libraries, they have more variations. And in the future, I hope they have variations for every single idea and phrase. Comes with at least 4 different variations. That's what I personally would love to see. And because it just makes it so much easier to create music when your pattern is dynamically evolving, not only with your chord change, but with new notes, slight variations. The trick is that you don't want to have too much of a variation. So if I turn on some of the other patterns, the midtone pattern, you'll see that it works quite well, but the issues really creep in when you're crafting your tracks and you just wish you had more variation. So let me just go back to the first. So the problem you quickly run into, as you probably heard with your ears, the they do offer you different versions, but they're too abrupt to the ear, so they're too radically different. In reality, what I would like, at least from my point of view, is variations that are slightly varied and not too radical, that allows you to beautifully change chords, but also change the pattern in subtle ways that make sense and that is interesting. But it doesn't take you an hour to go through and say, okay, this pattern sounds great, and then when I switch to the next pattern, I want it to sound good, but not crazily different. So it's all about being able to work quickly and have a dynamically changing pattern with the chords that works harmonically and musically. That's quite a trick to do with a phrase library, but I think Sona Kinetic is going in the right direction by offering different variations in their newer libraries. Now, let's take a newer library like Action Woodwinds. So let's just mute Maximo and turn on Action Woodwinds. So what they're doing here is when I change a chord, so they've given you a little bit more access to editing the phrase changes. So it's phrase-based, but you're able to go into the editor and take these phrases and make them radical changes or subtle changes. But again, it takes time because you've got to go into their interface, understand their editor, or learn their editor system, make some variation changes, and so that your patterns evolve with the chord change and also with some interesting new notes and articulations, but aren't too radical, but at least it gives you control over that. So I consider this kind of a more evolved situation. But because they're able to do that, you notice that it's called Action Woodwinds and it's not called Romantic Woodwinds or Drama Woodwinds. They have to keep it to a very specific theme. But it does, if they were eventually to come out with maybe have, 5 or 6 different types of woodwinds that allow this kind of editing for different variations, that would be great. But then, of course, you'd have to buy all 5 of those. So there are issues. You can get great phrases and patterns that dynamically change with not only the chord change, but with the music. But you really have to work at it. So my whole point of these 2 demonstrations was to show that. Now, I'm going to just get rid of these for now, shut these off, and then I'm going to do what I did on the last video. I'm going to import the RTS motion library. All right, so let's go and import MIDI file. And this time I'm going to import RTS motion folder, the entire thing. All right, so for this theme, my current theme's master track, which is scales and different variations of those scales, I've got currently this many different motion ideas, but let's look at one specifically. So we've got thousands and thousands of notes here. Double click on it, get to the editor. And in this we have, simple variations of 4 beats, 8 beats, and we have some dyads, some runs, some arps in here, some chord riffs, ostinatos, and different types of evolving motions. All right, so let's zoom in to one of these here. Now, let's talk about dynamically changing motion inside something like RTS. So just like we had inside a Sona Kinetic or the Action Strings and Action Woodwinds, you have a pattern, So those session players, they will play that pattern and then it switches to the next variation. Now this is a chord or a pattern that changes just by chord change. So these notes, it's the same pattern if you see here, but it's just changing the tone, the notes, according to your chord change. But then how nice would it be to be able to change that pattern subtly as you change the chord, but now the notes are starting to change. And that's one of the most interesting parts of an RTS system. It's so easy to change the pattern, the original pattern, and give it interesting variations that are still harmonically working with your master track, which you can take out of harmony whenever you want. But so now you're getting not only the chord change, but now you're getting a chord change here to the next chord with one note variation, which is subtle, but depending on what that note is, could be very interesting or subtle. You're in total control. So then as you play the next note in your scale or your theme, you could have two notes change. And then you could have maybe many notes of the pattern change, still with the chord change, but adding some interesting flair or rhythmic ideas. And you can just do this for every single note and chord that your entire theme, so that you can have them repeat if you want, or you can add any kind of subtle or radical change, but you're never going to get the same chord change with the same pattern. And you also have to remember, if I switch to maybe an 8th grid here, as I mentioned earlier inside one of the videos, that when you do a full chord change after, say, 16 beats, so 16 beats, it's going to play all these notes. As I hold down one note in RTS, it's going to play through this pattern. But of course, when you're playing RTS, most likely you're never going to play right through the 16 beats, but you could. And if you did, it would play this pattern, right? It would play all these notes. It would go through the entire measure at whatever speed that is set to. But more than likely, you're going to change chords probably after the first 2 to 4 beats. Say maybe after the first 4 beats. So you're actually going to hear these 4 notes, then you're going to switch over to the next chord, whatever that may be. It may be over here, but you'll be able to choose which one you want. And then that pattern will immediately blend into this, and then you may go over here and play that as a different chord. So when you create an RTS dynamically evolving pattern, not only do you get the interesting chord change, but you get a kind of endless variation depending on when you're changing your chord to the next chord. I may want to play the full maybe 12 beats and then switch over and just grab 2 beats of this chord and then immediately over to maybe the root note or the tonic, which is going to play this interesting kind of little run up. So hopefully I'm going to show you how this actually works by listening to it, and I'm going to hook this up to instruments. But that's what it looks like inside the MIDI, inside one of these RTS tracks that dynamically evolves. So you're not just creating a pattern, but you're creating really kind of endless versions of that pattern that go through the scale. But in this case, it's a very similar pattern. And sometimes you want that. But then, if you look further down, I change it up quite radically down here. So each RTS fills up the entire keyboard and has variations, musically changing variations, and sometimes they're radical and sometimes they're very subtle. But you're never going to see just one, unless you could if you want to just have repeating patterns. But you're going to see some radical changes in these pattern ideas. And that's what makes an RTS system so dynamic and evolving. because you're probably never going to hit that one chord and hold it for the exact same amount of beats twice. And then you're probably never going to switch over to the same chord unless you want to. You may want to have a nice little verse or repeating bridge or something where you just take one chord, change it over in the same amount of beats to the other chord. And it's totally up to you in real time as your ears hear this, right? But the point of this is that you see that these chord changes evolve in pattern type and they evolve in your chord change. And if I wanted developers to hear one thing that I'm saying today, it would be that you don't want a static pattern ever, really. You want to change with the chord, but you want it to change dynamically or radically or subtly, but you want it to evolve. And that should be up to the player as they're playing it, ideally. And even a simple pattern, which that's what this is, a simple single line pattern, you can see how it's always changing here if I zoom in a little bit more. See, this chord with measure would play this theme or this little rhythm here, but then the next chord, it's similar, but you have the chord change, plus you have an interesting change in the notes, right? So imagine if they could do this in a phrase library, where you have your interesting phrase, let's say this, but you have subtle changes for the chord change, and then you have radical changes for some chord changes, like this one's quite radical. But the creator of, whoever's using that phrase library could choose if he wanted a subtle variation or a very radical variation. So the way I personally would do it for a sonokinetic library is I would have not just variations, but I would have them in categories. I'd have maybe 2 variations of subtle changes and maybe some categories of mid changes and then radical changes. And you could literally just pick which one you want as you make your track. And that would take a somewhat static phrase library and just make it dynamic. And you could really use it in your music so quickly. All right, so let's get rid of all these. And I'll maybe just show you a couple more while I'm here, like these runs. So let me zoom up here. So you can have, like I say, you can have runs. Now, this is an interesting case, a run, where you want a string to, run up and down. But if you have a string that's just running up and down, endless runs, your ear just says, okay, it's just an endless run. That's too much, right? Especially for runs. They're good to be added here and there for harps or strings or glissandos and stuff. But you don't want to overdo it. So in your RTS, and you can have many different variations. Like I have runs that are subtle and runs that are steep and runs that are sparse. And the idea here is that you can have subtle runs, like an ostinato that goes into a little bit of a run, or you can have just a straight long run, and then you might have a couple beats that is no movement, because the whole point is that you want your music to be evolving and changing, but not repeating and not just doing the same runs or ostinatos. So even in a track which I call runs, right, you can have a lot of variation so that you're not just hearing run after run. All right, so you're really setting it up so that even if you turn on a track that has, an ostinato, it's not going to be just endless ostinatos. You can have a lot of different variations. And in a lot of my tracks, I will break it up and have many chords that have nothing. Like I will take something like this, delete that, and just have the first note run right for 2 beats or 4 beats with nothing. And so the ear's not just always getting that motion, that endless repetition, but it gets a rest, just like a real player would do it, which he wouldn't just be constantly ostinatos, but he would vary it. So you'll see that in a lot of my tracks, that it goes from movement to something more subtle. And I'll do that with horn tracks and flute tracks, where I'll put big breaks in there, and it just makes it, it stops it from being too repetitious. So an ARP 1 here is a good example of that, where I do have a lot of ARPs and movement and ostinato type movement, but then if you look at this chord here, it's you know, less than half that amount of movement. And then you can switch a chord, and then it's got a lot of movement, and then it's a break, not so much movement. And so the idea is you're in control of your movement inside of an RTS. Subtle, radical, repeating, it's all up to you. I mean, you could have one measure of music that really only changes by maybe 1 or 2 notes. So without repeating myself too many times, I think you get the idea. But motion, wow, it's like I say, it's so dynamic in an RTS system, because really you're always creating new patterns. As an example here, if I was to play this pattern, again, grab this, you're going to hear these notes, this musical idea. Then I switch over, I hit a different key on my physical keyboard, takes me over to this chord, and then it just slows down, and then, but immediately then I go to this chord, maybe over here, which is just faster repeating notes, and then the new pattern you actually hear is part of these notes and part of these notes, and they become the new pattern. So if I added these to these, that's what your ear's hearing as you're changing chords inside of an RTS system. So now let's actually hear what that sounds like. I'm gonna take this and that and delete those for now. And let's quickly grab an instrument, and strings show this off so well. Let's go to strings, and let's take something like the VSL Elite Strings. Let's close the editor portion down there. Set that there. Turn the interface on. All right, so now we have the VSL strings, and it'll just load in here in a second. Okay, it takes a while because you're actually loading in a full sized strings session here with high and low string, or cellos and basses. Okay, so it takes a while to load in for the first time. So we have double bass, we have cello, we have viola, and the 2 different high violins. And what I'm going to feed it, or how I'm going to play it, if we go up to its input, and we'll see, oh yeah, it's great. It's already set up to Remedy's RTS Motion 1. And if I look here at Motion 1, and drag Motion 1 in, we see that we can clear this out, and we have all this. So remember, I just showed you all those tracks that I imported. Well, that's what I have here, the exact same thing, and I can pick any one of them, and I can stack them. So let's get into that, and then, of course, you can shift one against the other, change the tempo, and transpose them. So if you have some vision, and I hope people do have a little vision, I think you can begin to see all the variations, because not only in the chord change and the patterns themselves, but each track can be set to a different tempo, different transpose, and a different shift of this information. Like if I shift this simple 8th pattern here to one beat, you can see that it's changed and it's shifted. But I will play that and you'll hear the difference. So one thing at a time. So now we have this set up with RTS with one RTS track, and it's currently broken chords with a bass note. But let's start with something very simple. So let's turn that off and let's go with that single line simple, which I showed earlier, some simple notes, and let's have it play the VSL Elite tutti strings. Now you're saying, well, that sounds kind of boring. That sounds kind of goofy. Yeah, but here's where it starts to get interesting. So now I can say what transpose I want. So let's take it down, and now it's going to play more of the cello and the viola. See how I do the chord change and it's gone from motion to a single note there? That's to give you variety when you start to stack up the musical ideas. So it'll start to make sense shortly. Okay, so now I can say that I've got a simple beat that's giving me variation as I change chords, but it's doing it with the lower instruments of this chamber string section here. But what if I say that, okay, I want a little bit of movement in the upper notes, and this is quite a bit of movement. So let's see what tempo we're at. We're at half tempo. Now let's see what we get. So now it's getting a little more interesting, a little bit more musical. So what if we add something on top of that, maybe higher up, maybe more rhythmic? We've got a lot of options, and each time I do this, it, you know, creates something different. So let's add that. Let's go with a 16. Then I could say, well, what if I wanted at a faster tempo and I changed the articulation? Because remember, you have hundreds of combinations of different articulations. And then, not to get too crazy, but something like VSL offers articulation sequencing, which means that you could have it change articulations while is playing these dynamically changing phrases while you're changing chords. So it ends up getting really quite interesting. So right now I've got it set to that. I could say maybe I want staccato. But staccato is it gives you a different articulation. It's made for not such short notes. It's made for short notes, but not super short notes, and not too much movement. But then I could say, well, that's still too low. What if I wanted something higher up? Then I could switch the octave. Then I could say, well, those notes are moving pretty quick. I've got like at least 32 notes per, like a quarter beat there, like a lot of notes really quick. So let's switch to a faster articulation and see how that handles it. Oh, okay, now I have an articulation that can handle these really quick movements. So now I'm getting something that I like. And let's say, what if I turn on a bass so I have something to shift this in time with? So I'll turn on a quick bass. This time it'll be the orchestra complete. So a different library, different system, but because it's hooked up to RTS, I should be able to get me a nice staccato going here. It's hooked up to RTS bass. And now let's have something to play with this instrument, with these strings. And let me turn it up on the mixer. So that's great, but now the bass isn't, I need it to move quicker to keep up with these fast moving short notes for the violins and the viola. But because it is RTS, as I've shown in the past video, we can quickly turn up the tempo. And we can say that we want it to play that C bass note, but we want to have it 4 notes. So now we're getting some action, and again, like I did in a past video, we could also turn it up to double the tempo. So now we're getting some interesting motion going, but you're in total control, subtle, quick, slow, fast, change the articulations. You can go here, and I think we've got 3 different tracks stacked currently. So now we can just clear off all this and come up and sketch with something totally different. Let's try this. Runs are more specific, but we could take a sparse run and we could do maybe a rhythmic chords with that. So that's interesting, but I want something more steady, like a steady rhythm between the chord changes. So I might go from those rhythmic chords, or I may change those runs and add them later, maybe more sparse and slow them down. But maybe I want to bring it together with some broken chords. Now I'm building the tension, and I have the rhythmic chords, but they're held together beautifully and musically with a broken chord that's binding it together as I change chords. So totally different thing going on here. And I could say that maybe I want to slow it down in tempo, and then I may want to add some more notes to it because it'll be playing at slower tempo, but I can add more actual notes in there. So let's listen. And my bass is a little loud because I'm hitting the notes louder. Now I may want to bring in some ostinatos or arps or anything. And now I may say, okay, I have notes that aren't that short. I have some longer notes in there. Maybe I oh, let's try a détaché, which is, it might slur some of these faster notes, but let's just listen with a new articulation from VSL. Turn it down a little bit. So now this, because I changed articulation, now some of those smaller notes don't fit in maybe as much as I like. So I might say, well, no, let's go to a short staccato note, and this will probably sound better for this one. But I find that that's a little bit, we've got short notes mixed with long notes. If I was to do this, I would take the longer notes, make a new track. So I would take this track here, I would duplicate it, and let's do that. And I would separate this musical idea, I would separate the long notes from the short notes. So now I've got this, and I would give them each a separate articulation. So let's do that. So the second track is going to have longer notes, but it's also going to have a longer plain articulation to handle those longer short notes with a détaché or maybe a longer staccato. So let's just move this a little bit out of the way, and let's say that now I want that to play with motion 2. So let's grab motion 2, and because every instrument can have its own controller, it's highlighted down here, so I go and just switch it to motion 2, which it is set to. And on motion 2, I can take those same ideas, because I'm using my same motion library here. I can just have it play some longer notes, like the simple line here. And I can also, because it's separate, I have total control of what string players play these longer détaché notes. And so all I do is transpose it down. So now it's going to be playing these long détachés, but it's going to play it with maybe cello and viola, and we'll be able to sketch if we like that or not. And we can speed it up or slow it down. So now we can take these longer notes and we can do the arps. So I can take and change this to what I like for short notes. So for short notes, I may want to have some runs or whatever you want for very short notes. We could try that just as an example. And because we have complete control, we could say, well, let's first start that out at full speed, full tempo, no shifting, no transpose. So now what we did is we've separated super short notes and then longer notes, and we gave them articulations that should work good with each note. Now that may be getting too high up there, so we may drop that down a little bit. And then we may decide we want even more interesting notes for the super short notes, and some rhythmic chords in there. So just more examples, and this is literally just I've never heard this particular combination. I'm just going literally random here. But you can create this as musical as you want, but this is how the system works. You have all these musical motion ideas hooked up to any type of articulation, and I may say that I want this to be shifted now, and this will be shifted against the lower détaché notes, and we'll get a different musical idea. It may be great, it may not be that great. Let's listen. So you get a different idea. And then quickly you could just stack another musical idea. But if that's getting too out of control, you could clear that and just start with something different and start stacking with that. And you could say that you want up now. Now that doesn't sound too good because it's just giving you some simple notes to start with. But let's add on to that. Let's do a motion pattern on top of that. Now that's too high. So what I'm liking there is the motion idea, but I'm going to clear out those simple notes and go with just a motion idea. That's getting interesting. Let's take the shift off, and it's pretty high, but let's take it down an octave. I'm liking that. And you're literally coming up with different patterns, different ideas on the fly. Let's go to a C major. We could take this up an octave. And yeah, you end up just having all kinds of musical sketching possibilities. Low pattern with, and let's take the ARP off. Let's go with a run. So that's a really interesting idea. I like that. So we could say, well, let's hear it in a lower octave. And then you could just go on from there, and you could say, well, maybe you want to slow the bass down. Maybe you want to add some more interesting things to the track that's playing longer notes to the détaché. So we could change the détaché to maybe a staccato short that's got a fast attack and, you know, or bold movement or more bold articulation. And we could say, okay, so now we can afford to have some more notes in that track. So motion 2, which is behind this. There it is. So let's just move that up front, and let's give it some more notes. So let's give it a rhythmic chord in there. Now you can imagine bringing in more instruments, some flutes, some clarinets, anything, some percussion. So I hope, since I'm doing this video in one take, I'm not going to edit this and show you perfect combinations, but I got some really great little musical string ideas just by clicking on different variations. Some of them work better than others, but the idea is to show you that you can have a dynamically changing pattern and be able to do that on any instrument, any track, and then have a bunch of variations, transpose it, shift it in time against the other track, change the tempo. It's really quite a dynamic system. And so that's what I wanted to show about RTS, its ability to take a pattern and make it come alive and change, not just chordally, but note-wise, dynamically, theme-wise with runs and ostinatos, and that you don't have to have just a repeating pattern. Those patterns can come alive. You have to program it in, how creative you are when you create those master tracks for your RTS theme. You know, you may just grab some repeating patterns from some library, but go in there and edit them and change how they evolve as you change your chords. Hope you got something out of this video. Hope you're able to play music wherever you are in this big world. We'll see you on the next video.